Dr. Alicia, thank you so much for joining us and good morning.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, yeah, great. So, Dr. Alicia, I'm sure that I have actually gone through your profile and then you largely work on you head the procurement as an altogether in department with the Kansai Plascon, which is predominantly into the painting industry and chemical manufacturing. If you could just quickly help us understand, you being as a head of the procurement, what are the unique challenges you usually come across when it comes to the local market, and how have you been navigated over the last few years since, if I'm not mistaken, you have taken this role over the last 6 months, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, so correct. I've been in procurement for about 4 to 5 years now. Started my journey from the imports department, so running imports for the entire group, etc., and then work my way up to eventually head of procurement for the group. Correct, we are a coatings manufacturer, and we've got sites throughout South Africa and Africa itself, where we actually do manufacturing, warehousing, and distribution. So, as head of procurement, the past few months, years, being in procurement has definitely been challenging, definitely a bumpy ride to say the least, given the status quo of pre-COVID, then going straight into COVID, which was completely sort of a shock to the system. COVID sent shockwaves up and down all supply chains globally. So companies were required to pivot extremely quickly in terms of securing supply chains, securing stock, etc. I think from local manufacturing, from a South African perspective at least, one of our major issues has been rate of exchange and rate of exchange exposure. So the chemicals industry in South Africa is highly dependent on imports, whether directly or indirectly. So we source directly from manufacturers all around the globe, and we source also from local distributors who in turn bring in imports themselves. So our rate of exchange in South Africa being an emerging market, very volatile. So any local or international movements in economies, politics, etc., has a huge impact on the local rand. So in order to try and stabilize, we have tried to diversify our risk and not sort of rely on a certain currency. So we have attempted to diversify imports, etc. Being in the coatings industry, there's very little input raws that are manufactured. So I'd say about 80% of our input, that's just raw materials, is we're reliant on imports. So that was a major contributor for us. In South Africa, we've also got security of electricity as a big concern. So we've got a concept called load shedding, where the entire country goes through cycles of blackouts. So it's almost like rolling blackouts. You have a schedule per area of when your electricity is going to be off, irrespective
Sorry to
of...
interrupt. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
So the load shedding part happens almost on a weekly basis, or how does that part, and how does that help when it comes to the company altogether? And if you could just
So,
specify in terms of the duration of this load shedding.
yeah, so it's essentially a result from the aging infrastructure, the aging infrastructure, and we are highly reliant on sort of old school coal-fired plants, etc. So because the grid cannot sustain the electricity requirement of the entire country at once, we often have power plants go down for maintenance, etc. We've got rolling blackouts. So where I'm situated in Durban, we've got different stages of severity. And some, like for example, today we're in stage 6 load shedding. So we've got from 1 to 8. Stage 6 is 2 times per day for 2 hours. So we don't have power in the morning and the evening for 2 hours each. There are some areas which are more highly populated, like Johannesburg, where the energy requirement is much higher. They may have 4 hours at a time. So it's essentially blackouts. So you can imagine the impact and the cost that has on maintaining manufacturing and keeping the plant going.
So when does this load shedding happen? Does the companies have also the backup system available, or does it also applicable for the manufacturing companies too?
So there are certain zones that are classified as industrial where they cannot afford to sort of go without electricity. However, there are businesses and manufacturing plants in non-industrial zones as well, and they are severely impacted. So we have to be sort of invest in buying diesel that's sort of unplanned for, UPSs, generators, just to sort of keep the throughput to the plant, because plants cannot be closed for 2 to 4 hours at a time, especially if you're running high energy intensive processes, or you're running 6 hour shifts, 12-hour shifts, or even 24 hours. So that has since 2022, it has escalated. It has severely escalated. We've been on and off for probably the past few years, but it has escalated to the point where hundreds of millions of rands, rather, is being spent on electricity security in manufacturing. It's taken a severe knock, both manufacturing and sort of the working from home. So we're still on hybrid in South Africa, where we have returned to the office, but there are still staff working from home. That obviously affects negativity, sort of battery lives, etc. So all-round impact, definitely.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Alicia. So I have two follow-up questions over there. You mentioned that your 80% or 90% of the import happens from the outside. So when you say import, does it refer to the raw material, or does it refer to the, so you get the painting altogether as a product imported as a white label product to the South Africa, then you label it with your cancer plaster, and then you sell it out. How does that engagement goes?
Okay, so we import our raw materials, so all the input raw materials, and then we manufacture the paint in-house locally.
And when you say you import, so do you have any specific destinations or any particular regions? Because by default, China dominates in most of the direct materials. So wanted to know the which all the country that you largely sources the raw material from, or is that also a diversification approach that you approach for?
Yeah, so before COVID, we were heavily reliant on Europe. We do bring in a lot of materials from Germany. So do our suppliers. So the distributors will bring in materials from Germany, out of the US, China, India, etc. So we do quite vast global sourcing. We are quite involved globally. There's no one specific area where we focus on imports. It depends on the raw material you're bringing in, where it's manufactured, and that whole supply chain.
Okay, and the second follow-up question you had, so you mentioned something on the risk diversification. So is that what you're referring when you have multiple sourcing as in destination? Is that what you're referring when it comes to the source diversification of the risk?
Right. So with COVID, it did sort of expose kinks and gaps in our supply chain, which we didn't even know was there. So we had to diversify very quickly. So we had to diversify regional sourcing sort of globally, and maybe move sourcing out of Europe into Asia, that kind of thing. We also did a lot of alternate material sourcing. So where we dependent on a single material for X number of years because the supply was stable, that was now classified as high risk, and we had to source two or three alternates should supply of our preferred material be either delayed or could not be produced or shipped, etc. So now we had to diversify in terms of supplier base, geographical sourcing, and the actual materials itself.
Okay, perfect. So what I've understood so far in with respect to the one is earlier you had a heavy dependency on the Europe, particularly if you the country you mentioned is a Germany. But now after this COVID has happened, the factor that you have started doing is diversifying the altogether sourcing destination, not only from the Europe, but the India has also come in the picture. Some of the also Reliance has come in as China and some other destination,
Correct.
right? Perfect. Perfect, Dr. Alicia. The second question followed by with the rising inflation altogether, the globally, and of course the African market has been impacted severely. There's no denial about because you
Yeah.
have also touched upon the currency inflation and sorry, currency fluctuation and the hedging as in methodology that most of the companies are trying to follow. So just wanted to understand from you as in over that since you have overtaken as a head of the procurement, how have you been managing to ensure that consistent supply of the raw materials keeps on going and then to ensure that Kansai Plascon's customers being their demand has been constantly been fulfilled.
So, just coming out of COVID, we sort of adapted to a new normal post COVID, where there was still a lot of supply chain challenges. However, we had managed to deal with those, like I said, with the diversification, etc. Just as sort of things were stabilizing, the Russia-Ukraine conflict came into play, and that sort of sent all plans that were made out the window again because it brought in a new set of challenges, especially in terms of the energy crisis in Europe and the effect that it had on the rand was extremely severe. So, if you can imagine South Africa's solvents, so we import solvents for our production. All solvents that we bring in are imported. So if the crude is spiking at above $130 per barrel and you've got your rate of exchange in South Africa over 18 Rand to the dollar, you can imagine what that does to the product price and what that does to the downstream consumer, which cannot always be passed. So with that, apart from sort of just consistent supply, we had to um, diversify to ensure that we've got a constant supply, but at the same time try and bring in cost-effective solutions along with diversifying. So look at suppliers out of your tier one and tier two. Look at suppliers that are new into the market that may be a little smaller than you used to deal with, but much more agile. So we were also looking for suppliers who could support us and partner with us and has the ability to sort of turn the ship around quickly as the market conditions and requirements were shifting. We also do a lot of supply chain planning where we look at forecasts, we look at historical data as much as we can. We do forward planning from our supply chain, our downstream supply chain, so sort of customers backwards to ensure what our supply chain and operations is planning, we can secure the pipeline of materials and we're focusing on the right areas. So if sales and supply chain are planning a certain group of products, you know where your focus is based on market intelligence, etc. So it was a lot of firefighting. Firefighting has become the new normal. We've got a lot of regions where we manage our own distribution. It is outsourced, but we do manage to the end customer. So if we're looking at from a supply chain to a customer point of view, it's from a procurement angle, it's a mix of direct and indirect procurement because you need to secure your logistics and make sure that you are partnered with reliable partners that can supply on time given the ever shifting market and the highly sort of the consumer demand being so unforgiving that you need to make sure you're on time, you are delivering the correct product to the correct region, etc. The manufacturing balance in South Africa is quite challenging because we have certain areas where there are customers, yet there is no manufacturing. So, for example, if we produce coatings in the Durban region, We will send it to Cape Town, which is sort of maybe a 2 or 3 day road trip. So we will send it to Cape Town where there are coatings manufacturers. However, the demand for manufacturing in Cape Town is so low for the season that trucks have to be returned empty. So that impacts directly onto your delivered goods, and nobody wants to be paying for empty legs coming back, etc. So it is a big challenge, sort of managing consistency and supply, if you like to call it cradle to grave, from sourcing to customer. But I would say diversification, knowing your customer, knowing what you're going to be selling. Seasonality is a big thing. Working along with sales and marketing to make sure that the activations that they have planned, procurement can support.
Perfect. So, correct me if my understanding is right. One major focus that you have during this altogether, you mentioned that talks about the focusing more on the regional suppliers as well, rather than just depending on the international supplier. One of the factors that you as a procurement head trying to also do is focus on the regional supplier rather than so and at the same time maintain the supply might not be the huge side, but at least to have the supply which would be able to fulfill your demand and more into the agile into the nature, is it?
Yes, correct. So we also attempted to partner with local suppliers. Either they could be manufacturing or blending or importing themselves, but sort of have backup tier three and tier four suppliers in the pipeline. Should our primary suppliers have production issues, freight issues? So, for example, if you highly reliant on shipping out of the US, the Savannah port is extremely congested. So the lead times to get stock out of the Savannah port with the mines in Georgia, etc., 16 to 20-week lead time, those are the kind of things you're working with. But if you've got local suppliers who bring in stock either from the East, China, India, we've got them as a backup in the wings to make sure that the risk is diversified and materials always available.
So with that question only, I just want out of curiosity, I wanted to know when you talks about the regional supplier. So regional supplier, the supplier, I'm sure you must be referring with who based in the South Africa only, right?
Yeah,
So
so we've got two types. We've got one that actually manufactures here. So they bring in their own raw materials and they do local manufacturing. So, for example,
okay,
the emulsions that we buy, which is a huge component in paint, is locally manufactured, but the input raw materials are imported. But we classify them as a regional supplier because they do locally manufacture. The second option is we've got distributors who represent principals overseas and manage those relationships, and we can purchase from the distributor sort of in rands uh, and based on their stock holdings and their own warehousing and that kind of thing. So that's the two options we've got for sourcing locally.
okay. So with
Yeah.
that only, I wanted to know since it's a Kansai Plaskan is altogether a chemical manufacturing company, then how do you ensure about when it comes to the environment regulation? Because ESG, that slightly refers to environment sustainability and governance as a major factor that most of the governments are pushing forward. And in fact, the European countries they are making a mandate for most of the companies and followed by most of the governments are trying to do. Then how do you ensure that these compliance has been adhered at the same time is still you are able to meet the demands of the customer considering the current crisis, the supply chain which is happening globally and including the inflation as well.
So we obviously follow the local South African government gazettes, and as they enforce environmental restrictions or compliance requests, we adhere 100%. But we also do follow quite closely what's happening in Europe because we tend to find maybe within a year or two, those regulations tend to filter down to the African and South African region. So we have sort of pipeline preparation, backup methods to and backup formulations ready in case our South African government has to institute European or US compliance laws. So definitely that. We also certified in terms of ISO, etc. So we've got audits based on ESG. We ensure that we are compliant, including waste, including who we source from. So we do regular supplier vetting. If we are getting a supplier to come on board, we ensure that they are compliant, apart from us being compliant. Even to the point where we've got something called the Global Principles document, where we ensure that up to the point of recycling, cradle to grave, child labor, that kind of thing, where they confirm that that's not done. And we do take it a step ahead where possible. We send our safety and environmental team to their sites to actually do audits. We also conduct, yeah, sorry?
So my follow-up question was over there. So when you are including of all those new initiative, does it impact altogether in your cost of the product, the final cost of the product?
So what we attempt to do when there are new regulations that come through, we attempt to work with the partnerships that we've established with suppliers to try and look at a few options. So if it requires a formulation change or it requires development work to ensure that your product is now compliant, we ensure that we try and work with the partners that we do have to keep the costs as closely to the current as possible. There are definitely cost implications where if you need to get a product compliant, it does have cost implications, but we do take environmental compliance seriously, where it's non-negotiable, even if it does have cost to formulation. It's something that we have to deal with internally. So it's not a no. We do attempt to contain costs as far as possible, but if compliance trumps costs, then compliance wins.
Okay. So it's more about the internal homework, that how you're supposed to do the entire planning, rather than, so you make sure that the customer should not bear any rise in the price because of the ESG is being, the framework is being implemented, and it's entirely depends on the how do you manage the internal, as in the way you do the homework part, is it?
External supply chain, correct. So where
Okay.
if a formulation has to have a cost impact, then we have to look internally on how we can manage that, where the customer gets a compliant product and doesn't and is negatively affected with price increases.
Okay. Perfect, Dr. Alicia. So my next follow-up question is more of a personal front, since your entire background has been into the organic chemistry altogether, and you have, I'm sure you have also done your PhD in the same domain. So how has it been helping you in terms of dealing and handling the complex supply chain challenges pertaining to the chemical industry? Does it have a relevance in terms of when it comes to the real-time chemical industry altogether?
Yeah. So I think further to the actual organic chemistry part of it and the technicalities, I think the PhD itself was the benefit. It's really sort of taught me resilience, logical thinking, quick problem solving, looking at various options, and how it goes together to sort of come up with a solution and evaluate risk and cost at the same time. So the PhD and having a technical PhD sort of really teaches you how to think and pull a lot of logic statements together to come up with a beneficial result quite quickly. On the organic chemistry side, so organic chemistry is literally a puzzle that you have to put the pieces together, and you don't always know what the outcome is going to be or what the end picture is going to look like, which has been the past few years of procurement. So you've got a problem, you have to pull in the different pieces to find the solution quite quickly, and you don't always know what the solution looks like. So it's definitely helped me in terms of knowing how to react to the unprecedented new normal that we find ourselves in. I think understanding the materials that I purchase, understanding the backward integration that's required, the energy intensive processes, the manufacturing. It goes a lot hand in hand to when you're doing negotiating. You better understand if a supplier is attributing energy or raw material increases or issues. I can sort of understand the processes and where the material comes from and say, but X, Y, and Z is not the case. And that shouldn't be contributing as much to the price of the raw material as you claim. Or I can justify and say, yes, well, the price of the monomer to your emulsion has increased because of its feedstock pricing being increased, et cetera, et cetera. And there was an issue in China, so I understand where the cost impact is coming from. But also, once we're out of the fog of COVID-19, of Russia, Ukraine, et cetera, we're still going to find ourselves in a very competitive coatings market, especially in South Africa. So we have to ensure while we are in business recovery, while we're managing working capital, while we're managing supply continuity, etc., we're also not neglecting innovating and not neglecting coming out ahead of the curve when the fog clears. So we still have to keep up with market trends. We still have to keep up with the green chemistry, with the ESG, with all the rest. So I can actually go out there, have the conversations, build the partnerships, look at the viability with suppliers and actually take it too technical and cut out a lot of the back and forth middle work, time wasting almost, because I can get it to a certain point where it now needs testing, et cetera, but the technical validation and the commercial side is already complete.
Perfect. So in a net, if I have to put it across, it's a more of an easier job. At the same time, it'll help you understand then how the entire navigation happens,
Yeah.
and to connect the dots more easily, because owing to your background, it always helps in understanding the how does the overall industry works from the from whether it's a back-end engineering as you highlighted, at the same time end-to-end process as well.
Yeah, 100%.
Perfect. So the last question is, when it comes to the Kansai Plascon, is altogether as a global company, and with it has an operation predominantly in the Europe. At the same time, they have an operation in Africa and other countries as well. Then when it comes to the global collaboration, how do you manage to do it? Because Kansai Plascon is altogether based in different countries, and I'm sure when it comes to the making a strategy altogether, procurement strategy, how do you go about it, and does that technology anywhere play the role in terms of enabling altogether your decision making?
So Kansai is Japanese owned, and rightly said, we are present in pretty much every continent, I think, except for Australia. But we have various entities in the major continental regions. The way we're structured is the procurement strategy and the requirement does come from Japan, but it's formed with the input of each respective country. So everybody has an input, but it is communicated and it comes from Japan. Thereafter, each country, based on their region, based on their markets, etc., formulates their own strategies on how to contribute and achieve the global strategy of Kansai.
So, sorry to interrupt here. So you mentioned Japan as if from where the major strategy is being driven and the decision has been driven and then been passed on to the different regional procurement heads. Is that how the entire approach goes?
Yes. So Kansai Paint is Japanese owned, and they are the parent company that owns Plascon. So essentially, global strategies does stem from Kansai.
Okay. And then, so the major procurement strategy happened, it's more of a centralized approach, or is it more of a centralized plus decentralized approach? Is that how it goes?
Combination. So, during formulation of the strategy, each country does contribute. However, the actual strategy is then formulated and communicated down, and each region thereafter does formulate their own internal strategies and tactical plans in order to achieve the global strategy based on their markets, based on their reliance on imports, based on their supplier base, etc. So how you achieve your own strategy. So for example, in South Africa, we feed into the global strategy, but we have to adapt achieving it to our local market conditions and make so we feed up into it. From a procurement point of view, every region has a procurement leader. So they would have a head of procurement and a procurement director. And pre-COVID, there used to be meetings in Japan, maybe annually or every 2 years, where the procurement leaders used to meet and sort of have think tanks, share information. And each country is a category specialist. So they manage certain major input categories into coatings. With COVID, obviously travel was suspended and not possible. But that actually did benefit those conferences because that moved automatically onto Microsoft Teams, and we now have it almost quarterly. So it's almost more real-time information sharing as opposed to annually. So the information is much more up-to-date, it's much easier, it's obviously more cost-effective than flying in procurement leaders for a week, etc. So we have a 2-day conference where the global procurement leaders can meet, share challenges, opinions, and request for help and assistance even where necessary. So if I'm having a challenge in another country or with a particular supplier, I can always call on my colleagues in Slovenia or India or Japan to assist because of the collaborative approach we take to procurement. Yeah.
Perfect, Dr. Alicia. I think that this helps understanding it better from the more from the chemical manufacturing perspective, if I may say, and this helps in understanding how does this altogether procurement best practices is taking place from the Kansai Plaskan. And thank you so much for your time.
Sure. Thank you for having me.